The Myth and the Wound. There is a scene in Spartacus, 62 seconds of film, that Universal Pictures locked in a vault for 30 years. Not because it was violent, not because it was poorly shot, because it was too honest. It told the truth about power and desire in a way that the gatekeepers of Hollywood could not allow audiences to see. The scene involves two men, a bath, a plate of shellfish, and a conversation so deliberately subversive that the censors demanded its removal before a single print could be struck. The man who wrote it was a blacklisted felon, working in secret for a studio that officially refused to employ him. The man who directed it had been handed the most expensive American film ever attempted, and told in no uncertain terms that he was not in charge. Spartacus is remembered as a monument, 4 Academy Awards, a box office explosion, an image of mass defiance that has never left the culture. But before it became a classic, it was a production nightmare. A film that fired its director after 1 week, that employed a screenwriter the FB I was actively surveilling. That clashed internally between a star who wanted total control and a director who refused to surrender it. Somewhere inside all of that wreckage, covered up by the studio, buried in a vault, was the scene they tried to ban. This is the story of what it actually cost to make that film. The end of an empire. By 1957, television was pulling audiences from movie theaters at a rate that panicked every executive in Los Angeles. Weekly attendance had dropped from 90 million in 1946 to under 50 million a decade later. Studios responded with spectacle. MGM had Ben-Hur in production. Fox had Cleopatra on the drawing board. Universal had nothing. Into that vacuum stepped Kirk Douglas. He had formed his own independent production company, Bryna Productions, expressly to gain creative control the studios wouldn't give him. When he acquired the rights to Howard Fast's novel Spartacus, he knew 2 things that should have given any rational investor pause. First, Fast had written the book in prison while serving time for contempt of Congress after refusing to cooperate with HUAC. Second, Douglas had already decided who would write the screenplay. Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10, blacklisted, his name banned from studio credits for a decade. Douglas went to Universal and asked for $12 million to make a film written by a federal convict based on a book written in prison about a slave who leads an uprising against the most powerful empire in the world. Universal, that desperate, said yes. The persona paradox. The public image of Kirk Douglas in 1960 was the image of American virility at its most photogenic. The jaw, the cleft chin, the professionalism, the devoted father. Magazines ran profiles of him smiling beside his children. What no profile described was the temperament behind the discipline. Douglas was not merely the star of Spartacus. He was its producer. He bought the book, hired the writer, selected the director, approved the costumes, commissioned the score. Every creative decision passed through him. The budget increase required his signature. That double authority created a pressure that would, over 18 months of production, express itself in screaming matches, terminations, and a creative standoff with the one person on set whose talent was large enough to rival his own. Cost behind the glow was measured not only in dollars. The decision that changed everything. Production began in January 1959 under director Anthony Mann. It lasted approximately 1 week. Douglas found his footage of the opening quarry sequence inadequate, had it reshot, and dismissed Mann from the production. He then placed a phone call to Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick had made 4 films, including Paths of Glory, a brutal anti-war picture made for Douglas's own production company, which had been banned across multiple European countries. The 2 men had already established exactly what their working dynamic looked like. Extraordinary wills, enforced collaboration, barely concealed mutual distrust. Douglas hired him anyway. He needed someone who could handle the scale. He did not care if that director was happy. Then came the second decision, the one that would reverberate for 20 years. As the script took shape, Douglas announced that Dalton Trumbo's real name would appear in the credits, not a pseudonym, not Robert Rich, the fiction Trumbo had used to collect an Oscar nobody could officially claim. Dalton Trumbo, blacklisted screenwriter, on the most expensive American film ever produced. The pressure against this decision was immediate and enormous. Douglas held the line. The film he was making was about a man who refused to renounce his identity under threat of death. Its screenwriter was being asked to do precisely that. He refused to let the irony stand. On-set reality check here is what Spartacus actually required to produce. The large-scale battle between Spartacus's slave army and the legions of Rome needed a location large enough to accommodate approximately 8,000 armed men, moving in coordinated formations across terrain that could be lit and filmed. No such location existed in California. Universal sent the production to Spain. The Spanish government loaned the production 8,000 actual soldiers from the Spanish army, not extras military personnel, directed through chains of translators who were not always certain what they were being asked to convey. The sequences were shot in Andalusian summer heat, in full metal armor. Blood compound attracted insects. Horses were worked in temperatures requiring round-the-clock veterinary supervision. Several were injured. Stunt performers sustained broken bones and torn ligaments in collision sequences impossible to fully control at that scale. Back in Los Angeles, the production was generating different problems with human beings. Kubrick and Douglas were at war. Not openly, no formal ultimatums, no legal confrontations. It was a war of increments, of disputed creative decision, of a director who believed, correctly, that he understood the film's visual grammar better than his producer, confronting a producer who believed, also correctly, that this was his film, his money, his name above the title. Wanted control of the editing. Douglas refused. Kubrick wanted to restage sequences he found theatrically inert. Douglas overruled him. Kubrick came from a tradition where every frame was a deliberate choice. Spartacus forced him into executing someone else's vision, something he found professionally intolerable. Would later say, "It was the only film over which I did not have absolute control." That sentence, for anyone who understood what Kubrick's career would become, was a declaration of intent. Meanwhile, Laurence Olivier and Charles Laughton circled each other with the wariness of men who respected each other enormously and trusted each other not at all. Tony Curtis worked himself to exhaustion, trying to hold his own opposite Olivier. The production schedule kept extending. The budget climbed past $8 million, past 10, past 12 million, at which point Universal's executives began sending memos with the tone of administrators watching a disaster unfold without certainty they could stop it. Douglas received the memos, did not slow down. What most fans miss, the film carries visible scars for those who know where to look. Watch Antoninus, Tony Curtis's character, flee Crassus's household to join Spartacus. The departure is abrupt, his motivation compressed. A viewer might assume this is narrative economy. It is not. The scene explaining exactly what he was fleeing was filmed and cut, and its absence leaves a gap the theatrical version simply learned to carry. There is also a reaction shot of Douglas in the crucifixion sequence that was filmed under noticeably different lighting than the surrounding footage. It was added during additional photography Douglas ordered to strengthen the climax. It's an excellent shot. It's also proof that the film's ending, as released, wasn't the ending that existed when principal photography wrapped. The chaos left its fingerprints everywhere. Most audiences just don't know to look. Conflict. Now we arrive at the vault. Trumbo wrote the scene that Kubrick filmed in the spring of 1959. It runs approximately 90 seconds. Crassus, played by Olivier with predatory elegance, being bathed by his new servant Antoninus. He begins speaking about appetite, about preference, about whether a cultivated man restricts his pleasures to one kind of thing or understands that appetite transcends category. He asks Antoninus whether he eats oysters, snail, both. The metaphor is unmistakable. Crassus is speaking about sexual desire, suggesting with a veneer of deniability that he intends to extend his appetites to the young man before him. Trumbo wrote it because Spartacus was fundamentally a story about being owned, about having your body treated as someone else's property. And this scene was the most intimate expression of that system, not gratuitous, essential. The production code office demanded it be cut before filming began. Kubrick and Douglas filmed it anyway. When the completed footage went to the MPAA for rating, the office issued a formal objection. The scene implied homosexuality, a sexual perversion explicitly prohibited by the production code since 1934. Universal, already $12 million invested and facing political firestorm over the Trumbo credit, did not fight. The sequence was removed from the theatrical release. The studio covered up the scene's existence so thoroughly that within years, most of the crew had stopped mentioning it. It became a rumor. The censorship battle was not the only front. The American Legion, which had aggressively enforced the blacklist, began organizing against the film the moment Trumbo's credit was confirmed. They understood correctly that if Spartacus succeeded with his name in the credits, the blacklist's enforcement mechanism was over. If a blacklisted writer could be credited on the year's most expensive film and audiences bought tickets anyway, the apparatus of professional destruction that had ended careers for a decade was revealed as a paper tiger. Universal's executives let Douglas stand in front of the controversy alone. Then, 2 weeks before the film opened, President-elect Kennedy publicly crossed an American Legion picket line to see Spartacus in Washington, D.C. The signal was unmistakable. The Legion's power over popular culture was finished. The blacklist did not survive the decade. The irony, by removing the snail and oyster scene, the MPAA inadvertently made Antoninus's flight more emotionally urgent, not less. A viewer who understands what the scene contained, who reads the gap in the narrative correctly, carries the full weight of what he was escaping. That invisible load makes his loyalty to Spartacus, his choice to die rather than return to servitude, land harder than a more explicit film might have achieved. The deeper irony is structural. Spartacus is a film about people who refuse to renounce their identities under threat of death, who stand up one after another and say, "You cannot isolate one of us." Trumbo had spent a decade being told to erase his own name. The film he wrote under his real name, about slaves who refused to deny who they were, became the instrument that ended the system designed to make him disappear. The most dangerous thing about the scene they tried to ban was not the oysters. It was the screenwriter's name in the credits. The breakthrough Spartacus opened October 6, 1960, in a roadshow engagement. Reserved seats, higher prices, intermission. Universal treated it as an event. The reviews rewarded the gamble. Cited Douglas and Olivier's performances as career-level work. Ustinov's supporting turn earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, one of 4 Oscars the film eventually won. The box office was enormous. Of its initial release, the film had earned over $13 million in North American theatrical rentals alone. Profitable on an investment that had seemed, at multiple points during production, potentially ruinous. The Legion's pickets had not stopped audiences. The MPAA's cuts had not weakened the film. Universal had bet $12 million on a production nightmare. The production nightmare had worked. Ripple effects for Trumbo. The credit was a declaration that the blacklist, as an enforcement mechanism, was finished. Combined with Preminger's simultaneous crediting of Trumbo on Exodus and Kennedy's public endorsement of Spartacus, the practical deterrent collapsed. Studios were quietly rehiring blacklisted writers within 2 years. For Kubrick, the production was a permanent education. He had directed the most logistically complex American film ever made and discovered exactly what it felt like to exercise technical mastery without creative ownership. He would never accept those conditions again. Every film that followed, 2001, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, The Shining, was made on his terms with final cut guaranteed, with studios that understood he would walk before he would compromise. His uncompromising control over every subsequent production was forged directly in the chaos of Spartacus. For the studio system, the independent production model Douglas had used, a star producer creating a project and delivering a finished film to a studio for distribution, became the dominant model of Hollywood filmmaking within a decade. The old system was already legally damaged by antitrust rulings. Spartacus demonstrated, commercially and creatively, that the alternative worked. The production code did not survive the decade. The MPAA replaced it with the modern rating system in 1968. Prohibition on depicting homosexuality, the specific clause that sent the snail and oyster scene into a vault, was struck entirely. Why it endures, when Universal undertook the 1991 restoration of Spartacus, they found the footage of the banned scene in good condition. The problem was the audio. Olivier had died in 1989, and the original recording of his lines had been lost. Universal hired Anthony Hopkins to dub the dialogue. Curtis re-recorded his own. The scene that had been locked away for 30 years was restored and released to theaters that year. Olivier's face, Hopkins's voice, Trumbo's words, Kubrick's framing. Audiences who saw that restoration saw, for the first time, what the film had always been trying to say. The scene fills the gap the theatrical version had been carrying for 3 decades. Watching it, you understand Antoninus completely. You understand what he was running from. You understand why he would rather die than go back. This is what the film contains: a convicted screenwriter writing in secret, a director executing someone else's vision under protest, a producer who staked his career on a political stand, a scene locked away for 30 years and restored with a dead man's words in a living man's voice. The chaos is not separate from the art. In Spartacus, the chaos is the art. Next time you watch Spartacus, and I genuinely hope you will, watch it knowing what it cost. Watch Trumbo's name in the credits and understand that those 2 words were, in 1960, a declaration of war. Find the restored scene and watch Antoninus's face knowing what he's escaping from. Watch the I Am Spartacus sequence and understand you're watching a film that fought for its own right to exist. This kind of excavation is what brought you here. Hit subscribe. New deep dives every week. And if today changed how you see this film, tell me in the comments. Scene hits differently now. I'll be reading every one.